Good evening all and welcome. A prominent member of our community, Scooby, has recently suffered a truly devastating personal tragedy. I hope you can join me in the comments section wishing her well, and I'd like to let you know, Scooby, that we're all here for you if you need us. And to Maltese Mike, I hope your recovery goes well. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Okay, so before I start this story, I would like to give you some context. I grew up in a town called Luther, Michigan, in the middle of Manistee Forest. I'm talking about a population of 300 people. I lived with my grandpa at the time, and we lived in a small one-bedroom cabin that he built deep in the woods. And to even get to it, you needed to drive down a 2-mile two-track. So needless to say, unless you knew who my grandpa is or your family, no random person is going to accidentally walk into our front yard out there. So, now that I painted the picture, let me tell you the story. I must have been about 7 or 8 years old or so. As I said, it was a small one-bedroom cabin. So my bedroom was actually the living room, and we had this giant window looking out to the front area of the house. During the day, you could see the driveway, the shed, my grandpa's project cars and trucks, and various farm stuff we had. But at night, it was pitch black, like someone had put a dark blanket over the entire house. My bed was positioned right up against the window, so I'd be sleeping right next to this window. And as I said, it's a small space, so I'd curl up with my back against the window and fall asleep. Now, I was a pretty heavy sleeper as a kid, so I'd be out the whole night. Well, one night after I said my prayers and got ready for bed, my grandpa tucked me in and sat by the fire to read his Bible. Most nights he'd read his Bible till I fell asleep, then go back and go to sleep himself in his room. And this night was no different. He got into his chair, took out his Bible, and started to read, so I slowly fell asleep. I must have been asleep for maybe 3 or 4 hours when I woke up. My grandpa fell asleep in the chair, and my back was hurting, so I turned around on my other side. So now my face was staring out the window, and as I was just about to close my eyes and go back to bed, I swear I saw a silhouette of what looked like a man standing right outside the window. Keep in mind, it was already pitch black out there, so this means he would have to have been standing inches from the glass. At first, I thought I was seeing things, so I blinked a few times, and it was still there. I remember feeling super scared, and I don't move. Maybe I thought if I didn't move, whoever it was would think I was asleep and just leave. But the shadow didn't leave. And once my eyes adjusted, I could in fact make out a man with stubble standing practically right against the glass. I did not move. The man then drew down his face so it was level with mine, and looked right at me. I started crying so bad I was shaking in fear, and the noise woke my grandpa. When my grandpa got out of his chair, the man took off running into the woods. My grandpa came over and started to rub my back and asked what was wrong. I told him what I saw. Now, I had a rough childhood, and if I lied to anyone, I'd get my ass beat, so he knew I wouldn't make this up. My grandpa turned on the house lights, went into his room, and came out with a shotgun and went outside. He was probably outside for 10 minutes. But I can tell you, those were the longest 10 minutes of my life. He came back, and his face was spooked. My grandpa was a Green Beret in Vietnam. He doesn't scare like that at all. But I can tell you that he looked freaked out. He came over to me and said he'd stay out with me tonight and even let me watch TV all night, which he never let me do. And the whole night he sat facing the front door of the cabin, shotgun in hand. When morning came, the first thing he did was put curtains up all over the walls. Then we went outside. Sure enough, there were footprints in the dirt, leading out into the deep woods. After that, I wasn't allowed to play in the woods alone anymore, and Grandpa moved my bed away from the woods. Now, about a week or so later, my grandpa was watching the news after dinner, and there was a story about a recently escaped prisoner that was found near the Becky Trail outside Luther. The 2 tracks that led to my cabin were the Becky Trail. He was hiding out in a hunting shack about a mile away from where we were. To this day, being left alone in the woods at night scares the ever-loving crap out of me. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and not long ago I went through a divorce that forced me to leave Orlando and move with my 2 young boys to my family's farm, about 18 miles outside of Valdosta, which you can say qualifies as the middle of nowhere. I had never dealt with anything truly frightening before, and at the time, I believed I was stepping into a slower life pace. The house we moved into had been in my family for years, but it was in rough shape, an enormous aging farmhouse with 8 bedrooms and a separate mother-in-law suite. Most of it honestly was untouched and needed serious work. When we first arrived, only 2 rooms were livable, and over the next 9 months we slowly worked through the rest, cleaning, repairing, and trying to make it feel like home. The layout of the house was unusual, built in a wide U-shape with a courtyard in the center, and I chose a bedroom that faced inward towards that enclosed space, thinking it would be the safest spot for me and my boys. One of the first things our neighbor across the street, called Jay, did was help fence in that courtyard so my kids could play without wandering too far. At the time, it felt like a kindness that I would never be able to repay. From the beginning, Jay made himself part of our daily lives, always appearing while he was supposedly tending to his animals across the road, offering help with repairs, tools, or anything else we needed. He came by almost every day, and over time I came to see him as nothing more than a generous, middle-aged neighbor, someone reliable. He refused payment most of the time, brushed off any attempt I made to compensate him, and never once gave me a reason, at least on the surface, to feel uncomfortable, because of how secluded the house was, set far back from the road, with my bedroom window facing that fenced courtyard. I didn't even bother putting up curtains in my bedroom or bathroom. It never crossed my mind that anyone would or could be watching. The first crack in that sense of safety came from something so small I almost ignored it completely. One afternoon, while my son was playing under the carport, Jay pulled into the driveway and looked at my car. And before he even made it over, my oldest casually told me, "I saw him under our window last night." The comment stopped me for a moment, but I brushed it off, assuming he had seen Jay near the property line where the horse pasture was visible from the kitchen window. Later that night, when I asked him about it again, he insisted he had seen someone outside, but I convinced myself there must have been a logical explanation. Looking back, I realized I wanted to believe in the version of Jay that I had already created in my head, so I ignored what didn't fit. Other things happened too, things that felt strange but not alarming enough on their own to trigger real fear. One day I came home and found my favorite candy sitting in the fridge, and my mum mentioned she must have told Jay something about it in passing. Then for weeks I received flowers every Friday from an anonymous sender. I assumed it was either my ex-husband or my boyfriend at the time, but neither of them would admit to it. My boyfriend even joked that maybe it was Jay. But then I laughed it off because the idea seemed ridiculous. One afternoon, I came home from school to find Jay working on my car under my carport while my mum watched the boys. He told me he found the issue with my air suspension and asked if I wanted to see it, so I leaned over the hood to look. As I did, he stepped back, and when I turned around, I noticed he was holding an old flip phone, one of those early models with a camera. I made a joke about how outdated it looked, and he just smiled. Later that evening, my mum told me she thought she saw him take a picture of me in that moment, but I dismissed it immediately. It sounded paranoid, and I wasn't ready to admit that anything was wrong. A few weeks later, everything changed. I was mowing the courtyard, trying to get it under control after it had grown wild, and as I passed near my bedroom window, I noticed something that made my stomach drop instantly. Sitting just outside the windows and beneath my bathroom window were cinder blocks that hadn't been there before, positioned perfectly like steps. I can't explain how I knew in that exact moment, but something inside me changed forever, and every excuse that I had made for Jay over the past few months collapsed in on themselves. I called my friend and neighbor Josh, who came over immediately. When he saw the blocks, he didn't hesitate. He ran home, grabbed a deer cam, and mounted it to a tree facing my windows. It was still daylight around 3 in the afternoon, but neither of us felt right about waiting. That night, just after 6, I got home with my boys and started unloading the car, when suddenly I realized someone was standing behind me. I turned, startled, and saw Jay. He smiled casually and said he didn't mean to scare me, then mentioned he heard my mom was out of town. I knew he already knew that. Small town and social media made sure of it, but hearing him say it out loud made my skin crawl. He told me to call him if I needed anything, especially if I got scared. I nodded, trying to stay calm, and got the boys inside. Later that night, after the kids had fallen asleep in my bed, I went into my mum's room to watch TV and decompress, texting my ex about the boys and a show that I had missed. At exactly 9:02 p.m, Josh called me. His voice was urgent, and the first thing he asked is if my boyfriend was over. When I said no, he told me there was a man outside my window and that the deer cam had just captured him. That's when everything inside me went ice cold. Josh told me not to panic, that he was already driving up and that I needed to meet him on the opposite side of the house. I hung up, forced myself to move as quietly as possible, and walked to my bedroom where my boys were sleeping, and gently scooped them up. The moment I stepped back into the hallway, I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran through the house and out the other side until I reached his truck, and we stayed there until the police arrived. The camera had captured images from 9:02, 9:22 and 9:30. He had been standing outside my window for nearly half an hour waiting. Behind the house stretched a massive produce field with a narrow tractor path leading in and out, and when officers searched the area, they found evidence of where he had been parking, but of course he was already gone. I showed them the photos and identified Jay. He was arrested at 2 in the morning. When they searched his phone, they found 9 months worth of pictures, hundreds of them, of me. Mowing, playing with kids, standing in my kitchen, inside my bathroom, even sleeping. Moments I didn't know anyone was watching. Moments that were supposed to be private. The image that stayed with me the most was one taken while I was bent over the hood of my car. He hadn't been helping me. He had been perving. After he was arrested, things got even worse. Within a week, he was released on bail, and not long after that, he walked into the post office where my mum worked and calmly told her he had found my dog, Ollie, dead, shot in the head, and that he had already buried him for me. That way he said it so casually, almost like he expected gratitude. Ollie had loved him. Jay had spent months gaining his trust, bringing treats and leftovers, even carrying him around and talking to him, taking him along when he went to feed the animals. Ollie would run up to him, jump into his arms without hesitation. Thinking about that now and how my dog must have felt in those final moments, confused and trusting, makes me feel sick. The police searched his property and found where he had buried him, covered carefully with concrete and a rock. He was charged again, this time with animal cruelty on top of everything else. Despite it all, stalking, trespassing, being a peeping Tom, the photos, and killing my dog, He only received 5 years of probation and a restraining order. But in a small town, word spread fast, and while the community shunned him, shaming him and cutting him off, even forcing him to avoid local places, none of that changed the fact he still lived across the street. I stayed there for 3 more months, surrounded by friends who took turns sleeping at the house and who bought me protection and made sure I knew how to use it. But honestly, the feeling of being watched never went away. It got to the point where I just packed up and left and moved to Fort Walton Beach, putting as much distance between myself and that place as I could. Even now, what haunts me the most isn't what he did. It's how easily he became someone I trusted and how normal he seemed while he was quietly invading every aspect of my life. I can't help but wonder, how many things did he see? How much of me that I didn't want to share with the world did he steal from me without my consent? To quote the children, it gives me the ick, and I never want to go back. This happened back in 1982, during a stretch of early winter that felt colder and quieter than usual, even for rural Maine. My cousin and I had made plans to head north on the Canadian Pacific Railway during the first week of deer season, since at that time the season opened earlier, above the tracks than it did further south. It was something we had been looking forward to for months, a chance to get away from everything and spend time deep in the woods, where the only sound came from the wind, wildlife, and the occasional distant echo of a train. We were driving along a long, isolated road that ran between Bingham and Abbott, a stretch of roughly 25 miles that felt like it existed completely outside the rest of the world. Even back then, there were no houses or gas stations or signs of life for miles in either direction. It was still dark when we set out that morning. About halfway through that stretch, we noticed something ahead of us that immediately felt out of character. There was a small, narrow beam of light, shining straight upwards from the center of the road, like a thin column cutting through the darkness. At first, it didn't even register as a flashlight because it was positioned so perfectly upright that it almost looked staged, like it had been placed there for someone to find intentionally. As we got closer, we realized, in fact, it was a flashlight, sitting upright in the middle of the road, with its beam pointing directly into the sky. My cousin slowed the truck down, clearly intrigued, and said he was going to stop and get out to grab it. Something about that idea immediately set me on edge in ways I can't explain. It wasn't just that it was strange to find a flashlight in the middle of nowhere, it was how deliberate it looked, like it had been placed there for reasons we yet didn't know. I told him not to stop the truck. I said if he really wanted it, I could just open the door and grab it as we rolled by slowly, but without ever fully stopping. And after a brief hesitation, he agreed, probably sensing that something about the situation felt off, even if he didn't want to admit it outright. As we eased past the light, I leaned out of the passenger side, keeping one hand braced against the door while I reached down and grabbed the flashlight in one quick motion. The moment I pulled it, I shut the door, and my cousin accelerated, and that's when we saw it. Almost immediately after we passed the spot, lights began appearing on both sides of the road behind us. Several scattered along the tree line where moments before there had been nothing but inky darkness. I turned around in my seat. There were people standing on both sides of the road, partially hidden among the trees, each holding a light. They hadn't been visible at all until we passed the flashlight, and now they were just watching us. My cousin slowed down for a second, almost like he couldn't believe his eyes. We both stared back at them through the rear window. None of them moved towards the road, and none of them tried to stop us. But the way they stood there spaced out and waiting made it clear that something nefarious had been planned, and if it wasn't for our quick grab-and-go maneuver, they very well would have ambushed us. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they began to fade back into the woods, as if they'd never been there at all. Neither of us made any comments about it after that. My cousin pressed the gas and kept driving, and we didn't stop anywhere along that road for the rest of the trip. The flashlight sat on the floor beneath us, still on. I've thought about that moment many times over the years. I know it was some kind of setup. They wanted to stop someone in the middle of nowhere, hoping they'd get out of the truck, distracted and exposed, assuming there was no one else out there. Only to steal the truck at best, or do something far more insidious at worst. A story on the news, no doubt. Someone driving in the middle of nowhere, with their truck left. That is, of course, the best case scenario, and them disappeared. Who really knows, though? I'm glad we never got to find out. I grew up in a rural area near the border, and this was back in the late 80s, and there were still checkpoints and patrols scattered around the countryside at that point, and it was for that reason that certain parts of the land always felt weird. One of our back fields, about half an hour walk from our farmhouse, was one of these places. The fence back there was always getting damaged. Sometimes it looked cut, other times just pulled apart. My father sent me out one afternoon to fix it before we moved cattle in, and I remember whining about it the whole way, more annoyed at the walk than anything else. When I got there, I saw the break right away. Near the far corner on the other side of the fence was our neighbour's land, and sitting in it was an old abandoned hay shed that no one had used for as long as I could remember. As I started fixing the wire, I heard a low, muffled sound coming from the shed. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a sheep, stuck inside, or something caught in the debris. The sound didn't stop though. It wasn't random, it had a rhythm to it. So I climbed over the fence and walked towards the shed. The hedges around it blocked most of the light even in the afternoon, and the inside was dim. But one side of the shed was open. I was afraid to get in because the air itself was rancid in there, and when my eyes adjusted, I saw someone standing in the far corner with their back turned to me. Whoever they were was wearing a white shirt and a dark skirt, and had long, black hair. She was moving, but not walking. It was like shifting in place with repetitive movement, like pacing without going anywhere. And the sound that I had been hearing was coming from her, this constant mumbling. I froze on the spot. I felt like I shouldn't have seen this. I had stepped into something I wasn't meant to witness. But I didn't say anything. I was transfixed staring at her. Then the mumbling stopped, and the movement, and I don't know how to explain it, but at that moment, she was aware of me. I turned and ran. I don't remember climbing the fence, just being on the other side and running all the way back to the farmhouse. My father didn't believe me at first and said it was my imagination and that I'd worked myself up over nothing. But I must have been shaken, or at least looked it, because after a while he agreed to come back with me. He brought a flashlight and a hammer, and we walked all the way back up. Of course, at this point the shed was empty, with no sign of anyone ever being there. But when my father shone the light across the dirt floor, we both saw the marks, and they weren't footprints. No, hoof prints. Impressions in the dirt, like someone had been standing there for a long time. We left quickly after that. My father didn't say much on the walk back, and whenever I bring it up now, he still insists there was nothing there. My grandma says it could have been a banshee. My girlfriend and I took a 2-week road trip last year and backwards camped and hiked the whole time. I'm also a girl, so we're two 20-something-year-olds out on the road. We got to one free campsite in the middle of nowhere, and we were the only people there, which wasn't unusual, so we took the first spot and set up. While we were making dinner, A couple pulled in, drove past us, and headed towards the back of the campground. No idea how far back it went. About 20 minutes later, they came back and flagged me down. The girl looked uneasy, like she was trying to play it off but couldn't. She asked if we'd been back there. I said no. She told me it looked like a massacre, bones everywhere, and asked if they could take the spot next to us. I said sure. For a moment it actually felt better knowing someone else was there. They stayed maybe 2 minutes, looked around, got back in their car, and then left, without another word. I told my friend what she had said, and right then we both noticed a huge femur bone lying almost at our feet. It looked like a cow bone and quite old, but still, instead of taking that as a sign to leave, we decided to go check it out. About 100 yards back through the winding campsite we found it. Carcasses everywhere, some scattered while others were still mostly intact. There was a pile that looked like fox fur and another deer body still inside a trash bag. It didn't make sense at first, but later we figured out it might be a place where roadkill gets dumped. Still, standing there it didn't feel all that normal. So many bodies in one place. We decided that would be enough for the night, so packed up and left. The second campsite was even deeper in the middle of nowhere. We drove for about an hour without seeing a single car. There were no houses or lights on these old country roads, and the sun was already starting to set. Eventually the road turned to dirt, and we crossed a cattle gate and saw a national park sign. It felt like a relief. At least it was something official. The map said the campsite was about 2 miles in. I turned off and started up the road. It quickly got rough. The brush on both sides thickened, dead and grey, pressing in closer the higher we climbed. The road was full of rocks and trenches, completely wrong for the car we were in. A low-clearance Ford Focus that had absolutely no business being there. About 1/4 of a mile in, we got hung up on a rock. The underside scraped hard, loud enough to make both of us freeze. There was no room to turn around or space to back out, so we kept going, but it only got worse. Every few feet the car would scrape again, stutter, struggle forwards, and the sun disappeared behind us and the road seemed to get narrower and darker. The brush looked lifeless, almost skeletal in the fading light. And we just focused on getting through it without saying much. After what felt like forever, we reached the top. The campsite was barely anything, a tiny clearing maybe 10 feet across surrounded by dead brush, and right in front of us a cliff that drove off into total darkness. We sat there, neither of us wanted to get out, it didn't feel like a place people stayed, and decided to leave immediately. Turning our car around on that tiny patch, with the cliff inches away, took everything we had. Once we got pointed back down, we crept down the road as slowly as possible, and every scrape and jolt making it worse. The damage to the car, all for turning around. At some point, probably halfway, I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Not just the absence of animals, but the no wind or insects or anything. And that's when I saw off the side of the road, between the dead brush. At first I thought it was just a shape, but it didn't move like a plant. It was tall. A few moments later, my friend shifted in her seat, like she had seen it too but didn't want to confirm it. We didn't look directly at it, but as we kept going I had this growing feeling that we weren't passing it. It was keeping its pace. Every time the headlights swept across the brush, there was the suggestion of it again. Closer, reappearing where it shouldn't have been able to get to that fast. By the time we reached the bottom and crossed the cattle gate, both of us were gripping our seats so hard our hands hurt, and neither of us spoke until we hit the paved road. We drove for 2 more hours straight to the nearest town, and ended up sleeping in a Walmart parking lot. Neither of us brought it up that night. The next morning while we were getting ready to leave, my friend finally said something. She asked if I had seen it and I said I had. She went quiet for a moment, and then said something. She said the first time she noticed it, it wasn't off the road. It was standing behind the car in the middle of the trail when we stopped at the top, watching us before we even turned around. And when we started driving down, she said she looked back one last time through the rear window. It hadn't stayed on the hill at all, but followed us down. Last weekend we were camping up in northern Maine, Baxter State Park, and I had a really weird experience. The night itself was eerie, pouring rain and lots of creepy noises. I and the 3 people I had been camping with many times are no strangers to noises or animals. Well, around 3 a.m, we were woken up by foxes screaming. Shortly after, my friends, in a separate tent, asked if we saw the light, to which I replied no, I did not see any light. I didn't think much of it and tried to close my eyes. Moments later, I heard them scurry out of their tents and into their car. I went over to chat. They were terrified. They said a light flashed 5 or 6 times directly into their tent. Again, I and my fiancée in the tent with me saw absolutely nothing, and our eyes were wide open. And our tent was positioned above in a lean-to and behind theirs. Any light at that time of night we should have seen. They were both adamant they saw the light flash from in front of their tent, which was facing the back of the campground and no road/people for miles. We got in the car and drove around until sunrise. The next morning we investigated. We went to the area where the light came from and there were no trails or camps or nothing. I even looked at the map to see if there could have been a car in the distance. But no. Then we saw something concerning. At the back of the campsite there was a small hill leading into the woods. There was a rat dug in the ground, looking fresh, and looking as if someone dug it out with a boot. It was the size of a shoe, maybe bigger. With the wind and rain, if it was older than the previous night, it should have had leaves blown in or around it. Anyway, we were spooked. It was just odd. I've never had anything like this happen. Does anyone have any ideas on what it might have been? This story has stuck with me for years. Back when I was studying with a friend in a remote part of the Andes in southern Peru, his family owned a stretch of land that used to sit near old silver and tin workings from decades ago. Most of the mines had been abandoned long before either of us were born, but locals still talked about them. Well, one afternoon, we took a couple of horses out to ride along the hills to kill time. The terrain out there is made of dry glass and scattered rock. You don't see another person for miles. Eventually, we spotted a ridge that looked like it would give a decent view of the valley, so we rode up towards it. And that is when we found the mine. It wasn't marked or fenced off, just a jagged opening in the earth, half hidden by collapsed stone and brush. It turns out there were multiple entry points, and of course, we went in. Inside, it branched into narrow tunnels and uneven chambers. Some dropped off into darkness, while others curved out of sight. We were messing around, exploring, until we came to a different section. At the back of one passage, the ground opened up. To our left was a vertical shaft that dropped at least 40 meters straight down. Even with what little light we had, we could barely make out the bottom. To the right, there was a shallow pit filled with loose stones and debris. Lying, half buried in the rocks, was a crude human shape. It was an effigy made from tightly wound strips of clear plastic. It was shaped just enough to be unmistakable. Around its waist was tied a strip of blue fabric. It looked like it had been torn from a miner's uniform. Growing up here, you do hear that the Quechua people in the region have stories about offerings and about leaving things behind in places where people had suffered. I'm not saying I fully believed it, but standing there looking at it, I was feeling quite unnerved. I didn't touch the thing. I just scrambled out of the pit as quickly as I could and nearly slipped on some of that loose rock I mentioned. Well, after a few minutes of trying to laugh it off, we decided to circle around and check the lower levels of the mine. There was another entrance further down the slope that led to the base of that vertical shaft we'd seen from above. Getting there took longer than expected, and by the time we found the opening, the light was already starting to fade. Inside, it was colder, and we followed the tunnel until it opened into a wider chamber, and then we realized exactly where we were. We were standing at the bottom shaft, and directly beneath it, there was a large, dark stain spread across the ground. Even in the low light, you could tell it wasn't just dirt. It covered a wide area, maybe 2 meters across, and soaked deep into the earth and rock. Scattered around it were scraps of blue fabric, similar to the kind around the effigy, and bones. Not a full skeleton, just fragments and shapes half buried in dust, but neither of us said anything. We had very little light, and were rather spooked by the scene, so we hightailed it out of there and never returned. We got out as fast as we could, barely speaking until we were back outside and on the horses once more. On the ride back, my friend finally confided something. He told me that some locals believed the place to be cursed, and they made offerings to transfer something onto someone else. I am confident this is the result of someone being killed and disposed of, or someone killing themselves due to their superstitious beliefs. Like, I am cursed, therefore I will/must die. Considering this area still had wildlife making its way through it, I can undoubtedly be sure that they would make quick work of cleaning up the body after the deed. But make that what you will. This happened a few years ago when my family and I travelled out into the rural areas surrounding Lviv. We were trying to find the small village where my grandfather was born. It was a place that hardly showed up on any of the old maps. While the further we drove, the emptier everything became. Paved roads turned into dirt paths, houses grew sparse, and eventually it was just open land stretching in every direction. At one point we stopped near a wide, empty field to walk around and try and get our bearings. It looked completely ordinary. Flat land, uneven ground, patches of grass and dirt. Nothing immediately stood out. We spread out a bit, wandering without thinking much of it, and that was when I tripped. I caught my foot on something and stumbled forward, annoyed, assuming it was just a root or rock sticking out the ground. But when I turned around, I saw it clearly. A rubber boot, half buried in the dirt at an awkward angle. It looked like it had been there for years. I pointed it out to the others, and at first it didn't seem like a big deal, just trash. But then I told everyone to look around. And it wasn't just one. There were shoes everywhere. A boot here, a worn sneaker there. The longer you looked at the landscape, the more you started to notice. Half buried across the entire field, scattered without any pattern, were hundreds, if not thousands of shoes. It didn't make sense. There was no house nearby, no dump site, no reason for this many shoes to be out here, let alone partially buried. That's when one of the older locals who had been helping us navigate earlier said he hadn't walked far into that field, just stood near the edge and told us not to go any further. At first we assumed it was something simple, like unstable ground, but then he explained that people from nearby areas knew about the place, and during certain periods or conflicts, prisoners and undesirables were taken there and never returned. There were no graves or markers, but he didn't go into detail about what happened there, and he didn't have to. Because once you hear that, you start noticing things you didn't before. How some shoes are positioned like they were slipped off in a hurry, how others were still paired side by side, and how certain parts of the ground looked more uneven. We didn't say much after that. No one really spoke as we walked back to the car, and even on the drive back we stayed quiet. I remember looking back one last time before we left. The field just looked like an ordinary field, and I think that's what made it worse. Nothing about it warned you what had happened there. This happened years ago, We were in a convoy of tourist vans heading back from a day tour in Palenque, making the long mountain drive towards San Cristobal de las Casas. The tour had run quite late, as they sometimes do, and by the time we left the ruins it was already getting dark. By the time we were deep in the mountains it was pitch black. There were 4 vans in total, spaced out along the winding road, each one packed with tired tourists. Most people had started off chatting or dozing, but as the road climbed higher and the jungle thickened around us, and phones lost signal as well as GPS, everyone started to feel sleepy and quiet. Even the driver seemed to rely purely on memory as the road twisted through the mountains, with no lights or signals. Inside our van were 5 of us near the back, including a couple of Italian tourists who had been excited and talkative all day. By this point they had gone quiet, occasionally glancing out the window like they were expecting to see something move out there. Then the first van braked, and the ripple effect followed, each van slowing one after another until we were crawling forwards, but none of us could see why. And then headlights stretched a little further down the road, and that's when we saw dozens of people. By the time we rolled closer, it became clear that there weren't 10 or 20, there were nearly 100 men lining the road. They stood on both sides, stretching far beyond what our headlights could fully illuminate, all of them dressed in dark clothing with their faces covered, wielding a long wooden stick or something similar. They weren't grouped together like a crowd, but spaced out, forming a corridor through the mountain. We were all quiet. One of the Italians asked, "What is this?" But no one answered. The convoy slowed to a stop. Up ahead, a few of the men stepped into the road, not rushing or shouting, but positioning themselves so it was clear no vehicle could get through. The first van came to a halt, and then all of us did. And suddenly it hit me how deep we were with no signal, surrounded on both sides by rows of silent figures that didn't move. One of the men approached the first van. You could tell from a distance how chill he was. No aggression. He went from van to van, and when he reached ours, he tapped lightly on the driver's window. The driver lowered the window, and the man spoke in a casual tone that this was their territory. He explained there was a fee for passing through. Behind him, the line of men seemed endless in the dark. Inside, the Italian couple had completely frozen, and one of them kept whispering that this was not okay. No one argued. Money was exchanged, and we left. As we passed the last of them, I looked back through the rear window. Even as the convoy moved on, they didn't disperse. They just remained, no doubt waiting for the next person to come through to ask for their fee. But all the same, meeting them in the darkness like that, lots of men who could very easily do anything they wanted to any lonely passengers in the middle of nowhere, you feel very, very small and vulnerable. Be careful when you go to Palenque. I was about halfway home, cutting through a stretch of backwoods highway I'd driven 100 times before. It was a long, dead straight 2-lane road that sliced through open farmland. There were no streetlights or houses. Picture this: fields and trees on either side, and that's it. So as you can imagine, I was quite isolated, and when I noticed a light in my rearview mirror, at first I thought it was a motorcycle, as it was just a single headlight far back, barely more than a pinprick. But even from that distance, something felt off. The road, as I said, was perfectly straight, so I could track it easily, and it was closing the gap very quickly. I checked my mirror again maybe a second later, and it had already gained an insane amount of ground. I told myself it was probably some guy on a sport bike, pushing it on an empty road, but still, I kept my speed steady, hands locked on the wheel. I thought I'd just let them pass. And as I got closer, I started to hear something I did not expect. as it was not the high-pitched whine of a motorcycle, but this deep, violent howling, like something massive being pushed past its limit. By the time it was right behind me, the noise had turned into a full-on mechanical scream, and then pulled alongside me. For a split second, it illuminated in my peripheral vision, and I saw what it was. Not a bike, not a truck. A massive old pickup that was completely wrecked and only had one working headlight, and even that was pointing off at a crooked angle, shining uselessly towards the ditch up on the trees. The entire front end was crushed inwards, metal, folded and twisted like something heavy had slammed into it at full speed. The grille was bent into an unnatural shape. For a moment, I thought I saw something dark smeared across the hood. The engine sounded like it was seconds away from exploding. Smoke poured from under the hood. I couldn't see the driver's face, just the vague outline of someone hunched over the wheel. It blasted past me like I wasn't even moving. I instinctively eased off the gas, heart hammering, watching it disappear ahead of me. The crooked beam of that single headlight bounced wildly as it sped down the road. Within seconds, it was just a distant erratic glow, and then it was gone. I sat there for a moment, barely breathing, trying to process what I had just seen. The smell of burnt oil and something metallic lingered in the air after it had gone. I told myself it had just been some idiot who wrecked their truck and was trying to get away before anyone noticed. But then, there was no way a truck should have been able to move like that, let alone run. Not at those speeds, not in the condition it was in. The next morning, out of pure curiosity, I checked the local news. There had been a crash reported not far from that same stretch of road. Multiple vehicles and several people had died. Witnesses said the truck responsible fled the scene before emergency services even arrived. They described it as an older, oversized pickup truck. Guess I know who I saw that night. I'd like to start by saying that I'm a 19-year-old woman, and my fiancé, who is also 19, are genuinely terrified right now. And this situation has been building over time with multiple incidents that continue to escalate. We recently moved into my grandparents' old trailer, which is a double-wide sitting deep in the woods with only 3 other trailers scattered somewhere nearby, far enough that you do not really see or hear anyone, unless you are looking for them. And while he is completely new to the area, I have known this place since I was a kid. So at first I felt somewhat comfortable being here, despite how isolated it is, especially since the rent is cheap, and we have the entire place to ourselves without anyone bothering us. It had been about a month since he moved in when things first started happening, and I honestly thought he was just letting his imagination get the better of him when he told me he saw something run past the back window late one night, because living out in the woods means you are going to see animals from time to time, and it is easy to mistake shadows or movement in the low light for something more than it really is. However, that doubt disappeared the moment I saw it for myself, which happened while I was standing in the kitchen near the front of the trailer, right beside an entire wall of windows that were covered only by a thin, sheer curtain that you can still see through if you're paying attention. My cat, who was still just a kitten, started going crazy at the window while I was cooking. I initially ignored it, because she gets worked up over anything that moves. But then, my fiancé walked in and immediately said, "There it is. Do you see it this time?" in a tone that made my stomach drop before I even turned to look, because the second I turned my head, I froze completely, because whatever it was moved so fast that I only caught the back half of its body as it disappeared out of sight. And even in that brief glimpse, I could tell it was not anything normal, because it was grey, with patchy-looking fur, extremely lanky with long legs, and unnaturally quick in a way that did not match any animal I have ever seen around here. I turned back towards him, completely horrified, and even though that was the last time we actually saw it clearly, we never stopped hearing it, which somehow made everything worse. It meant something was still out there, even when we could not see it. At first I tried to convince myself it might have been a coyote, but the size and speed did not make sense, and we do not have dogs around here because the landlord does not allow them, while wolves are not a possibility either since we live in a southern state where they are not present, which left us without any real explanation that felt grounded or reassuring. Funnily enough, the next major incident happened on Halloween night, which only made the timing feel worse. When I got home late from work around 10 in the evening, we decided to try and relax, and in the spirit of the holiday, decided to watch horror movies together in the living room, trying to ignore the uneasiness that had already been building over the past few weeks. We were about halfway through the movie when he suddenly paused it without saying anything, and when I asked him why, he just told me to be quiet in a way that immediately put me on edge, because he was clearly listening out for something. After a few moments, he brushed it off and started the movie again, saying it was probably nothing, but then I heard it too, clear as day. The unmistakable sound of our back doorknob slowly twisting, as if someone was trying to get in, even though we always kept the doors locked, especially at night. We paused the movie again and sat there listening in complete silence at the sound as it came and went, repeating just enough times to make it impossible to ignore or explain away as something random. Eventually he went back to the bedroom at the back of the trailer, which is right next to the back door, and came back with his shotgun, positioning himself near the door and waiting to see if anything else would happen. But after a few minutes of silence, he lowered the gun and came back to sit with me, clearly trying not to overreact. The second he sat down, the doorknob began twisting again, louder this time, and at this point I was in tears because the fear had fully set in and there was no way to rationalize what we were hearing. He decided he was going to go outside and check, even though I begged him not to because the idea of whatsoever was out there being close enough to touch our door was already too much, but he refused to stay inside. So I grabbed my rifle and followed him, because I was not about to let him go out alone in the dark. We made a full lap around the trailer, checking every side carefully, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no movement or anything. After that night, things did not stop. They only became more subtle, with tapping sounds showing up on the windows and along the walls at random times, almost like something was deliberately trying to get our attention. Then last night, it escalated again, when I heard something moving on the roof, and since we have a tin roof, any movement up there is loud and impossible to miss, which meant something with enough weight to make noise was walking above us while we were trying to sleep. At this point we were barely sleeping at all, constantly on edge, especially once it gets dark, because every small noise feels like it could be the start of something happening again, and the stress was starting to wear us down. We tried to figure out if there was anything in the area that could explain it, and we ended up walking down one of those nearby trails where we found a clearing with a large mound that had a direct view of our back door, which immediately stood out, because that is where most of the activity had been happening. Later, I asked my little sister about it, and she told me the exact same spot was where she used to have a hideout when she was younger, which explained the mound itself, but did nothing to explain everything else that had been going on around the trailer. The activity has only gotten more frequent since then, especially the doorknob twisting at night, which now happens over and over without stopping for extended periods of time. While I was at work during a recent storm, my fiancé kept texting me non-stop, saying the lights were flickering and the noises were getting worse. And even after the storm passed, the doorknob continued to move, like someone was still out there trying to get in. On top of that, there have been moments inside the trailer where we cannot explain either, like when I clearly heard him call from me from another room, only to find him sitting with all his friends on a game, all of them confirming he hadn't said anything at all. He also mentioned hearing whistling that he thought was coming from me, even though I cannot whistle, which only adds to the confusion and fear, because it means whatever is happening is not just outside anymore, or at least not staying outside. We have started looking into getting cameras so we can finally see what is actually going on. This happened about 40 years ago. I was in love with motorcycles. I had always dreamed of owning one. Me and my friend decided that when we were 17, we were going to get our very own. And we both did. We worked all summer, saved up enough money, we already had some in the bank from before, and we got our very first cycles. Well, what do you know? That within 2 weeks of owning his, he has a catastrophic crash and is no longer with us. And that's how I lost my best friend from my childhood. Now you'd think something like this happening to me would deter me from riding my bike, but you're forgetting that I was 17 and thought I was invincible, despite what happened to my friend. So anyway, I was driving late in the evening. It must have been around 7, just getting dark. That annoying time of day when the last vestiges of sunlight are partially illuminating the sky that is slowly being swallowed in darkness, and headlights at that time I find come on, but it can make it hard to see. So anyway, there was me, looking all cool in my bike, hair whipping behind my head, driving my bike. For context, I was in the absolute middle of nowhere. I was coming from a rather large town and heading to my home out in the boonies. My parents lived quite remote. This was one of the perks of having a bike. I now had the freedom and flexibility to go where I pleased, when I pleased. And bikes were cheap, at least. They were 40 years ago. So anyway, picture me on this country road. I was just turning in and started making my way forward when I must have twisted my head, looked at something that distracted me for just a split second. Well, around this country lane comes a car, and within about 1 second, I realize too late that there's going to be a collision. And a collision there is. The person either doesn't see me or didn't have enough time to react, but they slam into me and I get thrown off the bike onto the bonnet and land on the floor. My bike gets thrown to the ditch and I lay there crumpled on the grass on the side of the road for I don't know how long. The person never stuck around. They left me for dead or injured, and I don't know who they are, but I'll never forgive them for that. I woke up and it was pitch dark. Remember, this was in a time before cell phones were a thing, and so studying my surroundings with pain all over my head or body, I am a bit disoriented and do not know what to do. I look around, and there's one solitary streetlight illuminating a small patch of grass nearby in an orange haze. The light doesn't illuminate the ditch, so I can't see my bike very well. So with my hands I try and make my way down, slip, fall on my ass, and grab my bike. I try and pull it up, but immediately noticed that it was broken, with several parts now detached. I could no longer remember which specifically. Point being, the bike was now inoperable, and there's no way I was going to be getting home with it. I didn't really want to drag it all the way home. I still had a hell of a walk to go, and it was pitch black. I roughly knew my way, but I had no way of contacting my family to let them know this had happened to me, and I was quite sure I should probably go to the hospital, seeing as my head was feeling like it had been hit by a large stick repeatedly, and I had bruises and cuts all over my body. I get my bike and the adjoining pieces and hide them in a bush behind the road, hoping that by the time I can recover it, it hasn't been stolen. And then I start making my way, meandering through the wood. I go to where the streetlight is and look around. I know there aren't houses for a while, but I start making my way in the general direction of my home. As I'm walking, my head is feeling worse. I'm feeling faint, thinking I might have internal bleeding or something, and starting to panic in my stupidity. How could I have been so stupid to think I wanted to use a bike after my friend literally died a month ago is beyond me. The inescapable idiocy of youth, I suppose. To cut a long story short, I walked for about an hour or more, got completely lost and had no idea where I was or how to get home. It was dark, there was barely any moonlight, and I sat down on the floor and started to weep. I had never felt so pathetic and vulnerable in my life. After a few minutes of crying, I got up, and crying still, I kept on walking. And that is when I saw a light in a window. I didn't know where I was, and I didn't care whose it was. I approached that light until I came upon a small house. I went around and found the door and knocked, and thankfully, an old woman answered the door. Now, it being the countryside, I knew most of the people who lived around, but I had never seen her. She asked what was wrong, and I told her that I had just crashed my bike and that I really needed some help, or a telephone preferably. She told me she didn't have a telephone, but she could definitely see to my head, cuts and bruises, and took me inside. She gave me soup, which I ate very happily. The house was very old on the inside and looked like it hadn't been updated in years, and it was still quite dark. She told me to sit on the sofa, and it was there that I passed out. When I woke up, it was morning, and I felt slightly awkward being in a stranger's home that I didn't know. But something about it now seemed different. As I said, the house definitely had that old feel to it, but now it looked abandoned. I looked towards the table where I had had my soup, and the bowl was gone. The place looked kind of creepy, like it hadn't been lived in or used in a long time. I got up off the sofa, which looked like it had been covered in dust and dirt, and feeling slightly creeped out, started to look around the place. It was a 2-bedroom shack, is the best way to describe it, or modest home, I could say. I looked around. The old lady wasn't here. There was one door, which I knew was the door to what must have been the bedroom, and knocked gently on the door. The taps echoed in the room. I waited and heard nothing, and then I said, "Excuse me," and knocked again, and was met with no reply. So, I twisted the handle and pushed the door open gingerly and looked inside. There was a bed in there, old, with faded blankets, but no one else was in there. I assumed the lady had left. I had told myself I'd leave her a note, but I looked around for pen and paper, but couldn't find any of it, and only just realized just how derelict and empty this place felt. I looked around one more time and told myself I'd try the light switch. There was definitely illumination last night, but now it was unresponsive, like there had been a power cut or the electricity had been cut off. I didn't really have an explanation for that. So, after finding no way to leave my message, I decided to just leave it be, and walked out the front door. I still wasn't exactly sure where I was, but after walking for a little while, I rediscovered the main road and quickly made my way back, after only an extra half an hour walk. By the time I made it home, my parents were in an absolute tizzy. They had found my abandoned bike. Turns out my dad had worried about me not coming home after hours and saw the reflection of my mirror in a bush. When he saw my bike and that I wasn't there, he assumed the worst. He had gone to visit hospitals, called the police. No one had seen me. They were just so relieved that I had come home, especially after my friend died, you know. My dad begged me and my mum to never go on the motorcycle again, and I told them it was fine. My dad had already brought it back in his trailer and agreed that they'd fix it up and we'd sell it, and I could get a car instead. When they asked where I'd been, I told them how I'd meandered through the woods until I finally stumbled upon this old house. Told him that an old woman had helped me in the night and then I'd passed out on her sofa, only to wake up, the place look sort of abandoned, and there'd be no one there. A few days passed and my parents inquired again about where I'd been, because they wanted to thank the old lady who had helped me. My mum had brought her some flowers and some chocolate, and we wanted to go thank her together. So, me and her went in the general direction of where she lived during the day, and when I finally found the shack and knocked on the door, there was no answer. I walked in, the door wasn't locked, knocked on the door of the room, and there was still no reply. My mum found it really odd. When she reported this to my dad, and he had a better idea of where it was, his face went white. He got out one of his old maps and pointed to where the old shack was, even though he didn't know where it should be, and we confirmed that was probably where it was on the map. He went whiter still. My dad had known someone who lived there when he was younger. She was out in the village and had fallen down suddenly. My dad, seeing this, went to help her immediately. She had a serious problem and knew she'd broken something, so my dad took her to the hospital. Turns out she had broken her hip. When my dad asked who he could call for her, she said she had no living family because she had no children, and asked him to stay with her while the doctors attended her. He agreed. Once she was on the mend, he checked in on her every once in a while in that same shack, would occasionally bring her little cakes and stuff just to see if she was okay. She died shortly after, and the shack had just been left in disrepair. That's the thing that my dad found most curious. She was long dead. He knew that. And when he asked about the woman, I told him what she looked like, but said that my head was thrumming in pain, and the details could be all skewed up because I was exhausted and unwell. But our descriptions matched up. My dad likes to think that his kindness in helping her in her time of need perhaps brought her back from whatever realm the spirits live in, for her to do one favor for his son. I don't know what the truth is, but I'm just grateful that I got the help I needed, and I never rode a bike again. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. I hope you have enjoyed our collection of middle-of-nowhere scary stories. I will be back on Thursday with some Glitch in the Matrix stories, which I really hope you enjoy. And I would like to give one extra special thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen for their continued support of the channel. And if you would like your name in the end credits, a shout out on your birthday, and many other perks, feel free to find the link to Patreon down below for more info. But that's it from me guys, stay awesome and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.